Thank you. Big round of applause to Reni.
Hello, everyone.
Welcome to Gothenburg. It's an honor and privilege to have you here. I hope you feel
Thanks for having me.
Our excitement. Are you guys excited?
Okay.
We sure am.
I want to do a small video for Instagram.
Yes. Go ahead.
So, I don't know, just everybody say hello. Okay. Thank you.
Nice. Okay, so how's your stay been in Sweden so far? What's your vibe?
It's been quite brief, you know. This is my first time, and, you know, when you're here for work and you're touring, I don't really see much. People have been very nice, but it's been brief in each city. I arrived maybe about 3 hours ago into Gothenburg, so I couldn't really give you any sort of, like, really considered thoughts on the city just yet. Yeah, sorry about that.
Hopefully we can give you contribute with some kind of good vibes from this session. So before we start talking about the book, I'm going to have a little multiple choice quiz about Afro-Swedes and the situation here in Sweden. And I hope you guys are ready, because I'm going to start the question to Reni, and I'm going to give her 3 options, and she will give her answer, and then I'm going to turn the same question to you guys. I'm going to give you 3 options, and you're going to give your answer, and we'll see how good you are.
But you have to bear in mind that I've been here for 3 hours.
Yes. So hopefully the audience can assist you.
Don't expect
hopefully.
too much,
I'm not yes. Okay, are you ready for the first question?
Okay.
Okay. So, approximately how many Afro-Swedes are currently living in Sweden? First option, 100,000. Second option, 147,000.
That's quite specific.
Or 3. Third option, 181 Afro-Swede. 181,000 Afro-Swedes.
I'm going to go for option B.
Option B?
Yes.
147,000?
Yeah, I just thought it was very specific.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Yeah? What about you guys?
Don't be swayed by me, of course. No.
Option 1, 100,000. Option 2, 147,000. Or option 3, 181,000. 3?
We've got 2 here, we've got 3 here.
3, 2,
Anybody
3?
else? Anybody up at the top?
3? Okay, so according to a study called Anti-svart rasism och diskriminering på arbetsmarknaden, which studies the discrimination of Afro-Swedes in the working sector, and they have a very narrow definition of Afro-Swedes, which are people that have a sub-Saharan African descent, that are born in Africa or have 1 or 2 parents that have a sub-Saharan African descent. And according to that study, it's 147,000.
Yes!
47,000. Good job. Second question. Okay. Which among the Afro-Swedish group in Sweden, which
147,000.
Yes, yep. Among them, which ethnic group is the largest among them?
Okay, what are our options?
Okay.
Okay.
A, or 1, Eritreans. Whoop, 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 whoop. Okay, okay,
biased,
yes,
guys.
okay, we're here. Option number 2, Somalians. Somalians.
Up in the audience, I've got 1, 2 over there. Hey.
Option number 3, Gambians.
Oh, Gambians. Okay. I'm going to go with option 1 or A.
Eritreans, yes?
Yeah, yeah. A or 1, whatever, however you're classifying each option.
Yeah. The first one. What about you guys? 1 or A, Eritreans. 2 or B, Somalians. 3 or C, Gambians. 2? 2?
We've got some 2s here. We've got
2.
That seems to be the overwhelming audience.
Okay,
choice.
So a hint. My father calls Gothenburg Lilla Mogadishu.
Okay.
That is the small Mogadishu, which is the capital of Somalia.
I see.
Somalians are the largest Afro-Swedish ethnic group, and according to a study, Afrofobi-rapporten 2014, they were approximately over 50,000.
I see, I see.
So, yeah. Yeah.
Well, I was incorrect. But
good job. Third and last question. When did the first Africans arrive to Sweden?
okay. Hit us with the options.
Okay. Option A, or 1, 1647. Option 2, or B, 1852. Option 3, or C, 1739. So what year did the first Africans arrive to Sweden?
Well, I'm going to go with 1 because I feel like, just in general, African people have been around in Europe for quite a while. But, you know, I don't really have the historical knowledge. This is just a guess.
Yep.
A hopeful guess. What do you lot think?
What do you think? 1, 1. Oh, wow. 1, 1, 3.
But then, I mean, we are quite far north in terms of the general world, so it could be later. You know, Sweden is quite far north, isn't it? I don't know, that's just my guess.
Let me say this. According to...
It takes a while to get here. Anyway, sorry.
The right answer is option 1, or A, 1647. In 1647, the first Swedish slave expedition brought 4 African children to Sweden as a gift to the Chancellor Axel Oxenstierna.
Wow, okay. Well, that's a damning indictment.
How many of y'all knew that?
Of Sweden.
Yes.
So much for neutrality and... Okay, well,
yes.
I guess we're about to get into it.
So, how many of you guys have read the book? Oh.
Saying a third of the audience?
Yes.
Cool, thank you.
Good job. Good job.
I appreciate it.
So just a short summary. This book takes you on a journey through Reni's personal experiences and reflections of structural racism as she digs into Black British history and contemporary British politics. There are many topics that are touched upon, such as white privilege and white feminism, the intersectional character of race, gender, and class. But it also touches upon issues such as tokenism and performative anti-racism. The book also analyzes the effects structural racism have on people of color that often internalizes ideas of white superiority by adopting white standards of beauty, but also sometimes can find themselves assimilating to those ideals. And also buying into the notion that education and social class or economical higher class can free oneself from racism, which is a lie. But it was a fantastic read, and I personally felt that I could relate to some of the personal experiences you've shared in the book. And one of the topics that I felt struck like a specific nerve for me was how you were talking about being robbed of a Black historic perspective, of being held in the dark by such a fundamental part of British history. And I want to talk a little bit about that, and also, if I may, I can read this part.
Okay.
Should I do it in Swedish or English? That is the question.
Okay, what's the audience thinking?
English.
Okay.
Okay. Okay. No.
I mean, you can read it in Swedish if you want. I'm so familiar with the text at this point that I'd probably be able to get the gist.
Yeah?
Yeah.
So you prefer it?
No, but we're going with what the majority wants.
Okay, good.
Yes.
Okay, let's see if I can find it here. Here.
I will not override majority rule.
No.
This is a democracy.
Yes. So the text goes, but I don't think my ignorance was an individual thing, that I had to go looking for significant moments in Black British history suggests to me that I had been kept ignorant. While the Black British history is starved of oxygen, the US struggle against racism is globalized into the story of the struggle against racism that we should look to for inspiration, eclipsing the Black British story so much that we convince ourselves that Britain has never had a problem with race. Can you relate to this in Sweden? So can you talk just like a personal reflection of this robbing of this knowledge? What did it do to you?
Okay. I mean, first off, it's nice to be here. Thanks everybody for turning out on, is it a Thursday today?
Yes,
this Thursday evening. I appreciate it. I must push back on your description of the book a bit, in terms of like it being my personal reflections. I wouldn't say it's a memoir. In fact, I come from a background of reporting, and so I would say that there's probably more reporting on like primary and secondary sources than there is my personal like reflections on the book. And for me, that was important to come from a background of sort of reporting on old documents, and also, you know, speaking to people in interviews and some of my journalism from before the book even came out, because I thought it was quite important to, it was about building a bigger case than just my personal thoughts and feelings, you know, which I'm not going to do down. I think it's, you know, important, and, you know, memoir is a great genre of non-fiction, but for me, I wanted to write something that had a bit of a wider scope, so I just wanted to say that. So let's talk about that chapter about Black British history in particular. I think that's probably a good example of the approach that I was trying to take when I was writing the book, because, yes, you know, in terms of the beginning and end of it, I'm talking about my personal experiences and why I went off to go and find that information in the first place. But the information, you know, is stuff that wasn't, you know, I'm less than 30 years old. I'm 29. Less than 30 years old? That doesn't make sense. I'm 29 years old, and a lot of the stuff that I was writing about in that chapter happened before I was born or when I was very young. I really wanted to draw on examples from very recent history and more to contextualize that chapter from basically the beginning of the last century onwards. And so that involved going to, you know, the Black Cultural Archives, which is in South London, and the British Library, and trying to find evidence for all of the stories and anecdotes that I'd been told where I was growing up in North London that I hadn't learnt through history books. So, you know, I grew up in like Tottenham in North London, and it was a site of extreme race riots about 30 years ago now. And that was something that I'd heard anecdotally from people who lived near me, but that conversation hadn't been canonized in the same way that, you know, other like significant moments of the last 30 years in Britain had been. So for me, it was really important to just give voice to some of the more, I don't know, I'm loath to say forgotten, because I also have to recognize my youth in this conversation, and there are many people still walking this earth who were there at the time, some of whom I went to go and speak to for the book. But I do think that the information about racial discrimination in Britain is in danger of being locked in those people's heads, because it hadn't become canon, it hadn't become a part of how the country understood itself. And, you know, like, I don't think it's a coincidence that, you know, the book just happened to be published around the time that everyone was still reeling from Brexit. And I think that people were really, like, looking around for some kind of explanation about why that had happened, particularly as, like, the Leave campaign had utilized a lot of very, like, virulently xenophobic rhetoric, and had, you know, leaders of that campaign had gone off to cozy up with people like Marine Le Pen. I think people in the country in general were thinking, how could this have happened? And so then this book comes along and it's like, hey, look, here are some like seriously grave racist incidents in the last century that like knitted together make a pattern of extreme structural racism that we don't really understand to be part of Britain. And that could contextualize why the far right are making such gains today, you know? Is that enough of personal reflection for you in terms of why I went about doing that? Yes.
I would say.
Okay.
So we can go on to the next question then, where, let's see if I can find it, 71. About discrimination in the working force. And you develop, I wouldn't say that you develop a concept, but you're talking about kind of like a false myth of meritocracy. Do you say meritocracy like that, or how do you
Meritocracy.
say it? Yes.
Meritocracy.
Yes. And you explain it in a very fantastic way. Let me see if I can find it in the page 71, I think it is.
You can just say it off the top of your head. You don't have to look at the page each time.
Yes. Yeah. So I want you to describe that myth and how it plays a significant role in upholding structural discrimination.
Must I?
You don't have to.
I mean,
but for some people that don't.
So you want me to say what it is? Okay. But I already explained it in the book.
Yes, you did.
Yes.
I can read it. I can read it.
Okay, you read it then.
Yes, I can read it. And then you can just comment it.
All right. Yeah, I wrote it, and I don't know. I don't like repeating myself too much.
Let's see if I can find it here. No, it has to be here.
Sorry for.
Well, I can't really. I can find it in Swedish, but I can't find it here.
Yeah, just read it out in Swedish. Look, there's your notes.
Yes, this will be very easy for me. So, nu är det sida 70-71, så det är kapitlet om systemet. Så. Att på detta sätt betona meriter och påstå att den nuvarande majoriteten av vitt ledarskap inom olika näringsgrenar har nått sina positioner genom hårt arbete och utan hjälp utifrån, som om vitheten inte är sin egen förmån. Som om den inte skapar en igenkänning som gör en intervjuare mer positivt inställd till en sökande. När alla de delar av samhället som jag har tagit upp har en sådan bedrövlig raslig representation måste medvetet lura sig själv om en verkligen tror att en homogen klump av medelålders vita män som för närvarande täpper till de högre nivåerna inom de flesta yrkena nådde dit enbart genom begåvning. Vi lever inte i en meritokrati, och att låtsas att hårt arbete i sig kan ge framgång åt alla är att medvetet hålla sig kunnig. So for me, this...
You get the gist.
Yes. For me, this part was like spot on, because I've found myself in so many discussions when we talk about employment and that people of different races or different minorities don't have the equal opportunities to get whatever job or whatever they're looking for. But people still are fighting and claiming that we have a structure that is working out of meritocracy.
Yeah, I mean, I said this last night. I think that, like, you know, you can look at any corridor or like powerful institution in Britain, and it's probably quite the same in Sweden as well. And everybody kind of looks the same. It's a pretty homogenous crowd. And I just think that if you really truly believe that they are there basically on their merit and not because the organization is recruiting in its image and likeness, then what the implication is that you just think that white straight middle-aged men are the most talented, like, in this world.
Yeah.
And like, I just kind of don't believe that. Not just my own personal belief based on people I've met in the world, and I've met lots of intelligent and talented people in the world from all sorts of different backgrounds and ethnicities, but also like the data doesn't actually back it up. And so like there was this study that happened, the Department for Work and Pensions in 2009, so this was a while ago, it was a decade ago, but a study on this scale hasn't really been done in Britain since. So I always refer to it, in which, you know, they sent out, I think, 2,000 CVs and applied for jobs all around the country. And people with African and Asian-sounding names were far less likely to be called to interview than their white counterparts with white British-sounding names. And these, by the way, were just made-up names. Despite those CVs having similar qualifications and experience. And so I think that was a really good example of literally the data showing that organizations aren't necessarily recruiting on merit. There's bias literally inherent in the system of recruitment. But of course, if you then go to the HR manager, they'll be like, no, of course, it's all about merit here. No bias. Yet the big picture data shows that if your name literally sounds African or Asian, your CV is less likely to be considered for a role that you're probably qualified for. And I think that flies in the face of meritocracy. In fact, again, like when you look at the big data to do with hiring and inequality, it shows organizations don't often actually recruit on merit. And so I think that you know, that goal and that aim of meritocracy, sure, it's admirable, but we can't just be complacent and be like, well, it's meritocratic because I say so. Like, you actually have to kind of do some work to make it that way and to really challenge the bias in the system. I think you have to start from a position where it's like, right, well, there will be bias in the system, so how do we create systems that challenge the bias? It doesn't necessarily have to be interrogating oneself. It could be something as simple as like taking names off CVs, you know?
Yeah.
And that's been shown actually to essentially overcome some of the bias, you know? It doesn't have to be going and self-flagellating in a corner as a white person, being like, oh no, I'm racist, oh no, please, I just can't take it anymore, and crying. That's not necessary. I think it's just about being smart and strategic, but start from a basis where you're like, okay, there is bias in this system, because the evidence shows that it is. And I'll reiterate, if we really believe that we do live in a meritocracy, then we are implicitly saying that everybody at the top in that incredibly homogenous, you know, layer of society, those people who just happen to be born into those types of bodies are the more talented out of everybody in our population. And I don't think that that is the case.
Agree. Yes.
Thank you. Thanks, guys.
We agree. And talking about this subject, it also brings me into the concept of representation and also the concept of tokenism. And it's an issue that I've been discussing at home as well, because how I've been raised, they see it as a success for me or for people of my background to get a chance into some of these homogeneous working spaces that are connected to influence and status and such. And for them to hear me calling out some of these political issues.
Yeah, you're talking. Just be grateful.
Yes. How can I handle this situation with my parents? I want them to be able to problematize this issue, but at the same time, I understand their pride and the sense of feeling like our daughter, she's successful and she made it, but did I really?
I think for those of us who are like navigating, you know, prestigious spaces that tend to lean towards being all white, and so like you're the only person of color in the room, I think that one is subject to a number of different pressures, both internal and external. So let's go over the external pressures initially. The fact of the matter is, and this is based on the data that I cite in the book, and I cite that data because I used to work at an anti-racism think tank, so I had like loads of access to swathes of often government data about racial inequality. And the fact of the matter is, in Britain, in institutions that we expect to treat us all equally, so employment, education, healthcare, housing, and higher education, black people in particular, but more broadly, I would say most people who are not white, fare worse off than their white counterparts. That's if you take race into the equation solely. Of course, there are other types of structural discrimination that impact it, like gender and sexuality and class and those things. But repeatedly, like when you look at the big picture data, and I write about it in the book as well, it's not that one won't succeed and one won't thrive in those environments, but one will face more barriers. And so if one does keep climbing up the ladder, the data shows that for somebody who's not white, they've probably worked harder or have had to edit themselves or change the way that they present or perhaps talk or in some way in order to get to that position in the first place. And I once had a very contentious conversation about this with a white woman who came up to me because, unfortunately, because of the book I've written, people try and see me as some sort of argument symbol, argument punching bag. So this woman comes up to me and she's like, yeah, this black girl at my work, like, she said at a staff meeting that she's probably worked harder than those of us who are white in the room, and I just found that really offensive. And I was like, but the data literally backs up her statement. Like, it literally backs up her statement. And that's not to say that you haven't worked hard or to take away any of the hard work that you've got done to get into that position, but the data literally shows that black people in particular, at each life progression stage, in these big institutions that we expect to treat us fairly, there is bias in the system. In the book I talk about, the example of a hypothetical black boy, and when it comes to what do I call it? Primary school? Do you call it primary school here? Yeah. When it comes to taking the exams when you're leaving primary school and going to secondary school, there was a government study that showed that children around that age, 11, black children in particular, were undermarked by their own teachers on the exam papers, and that was something that was rectified. They got higher grades when an external teacher marked their papers. So that affects what school a child might get into. When it comes to applying for university, a similar dynamic happens in which black students were far more likely to get lower grades than their white counterparts. I just cited that employment study as well. And so repeatedly, I think everyone who's grown up in an immigrant background has been told, you have to work twice as hard. You have to work twice as hard, basically for half the reward. And it's a little bit of an immigrant cliche at this point, but it is, I think when parents are telling us that, they don't know that it's informed by the data, but the data literally backs up that statement. So you're faced with that position, you're faced with that problem and that hard slog to get to the point in your white cultural institution. And I think that, personally, that I think that's something that I faced in terms of like the precariousness and financial insecurity that I went through as a freelance journalist to even get to the point that this book was published. And I don't think that my white peers faced the same kind of struggle. I simply don't. That's not to dismiss their talent. I do think they're talented, but I also think that I was equally talented and I got less investment and opportunity. So you deal with that, you work harder to get into the room, and then when you get into the room, if you're the only person of color, there's this sort of like underlying, unsaid thing in some of these like prestigious white spaces that, oh, you're just there for the diversity quota. So despite the fact that you've probably had to work hard, there's an underlying assumption that you're just there to fill a quota and that you're just a token and that you're probably not talented at all. And again, I think that like in terms of conversations around meritocracy, when people deeply believe that, they'll push back against any positive discrimination or any positive action initiative. And they'll say, well, we want it to be qualified people. And if we go outside of our usual pool, then the people if we start to do targeted recruitment for people of color, they probably won't be as qualified for the position. I mean, it's a total insult. It's a total insult, particularly as the data literally proves that people of color have to work twice as hard. So you've got those external pressures where you've probably had to work hard, and then you get in the room and people are like, oh, you're the diversity hire. Okay, well, this is how you turn on a computer. And then you have, I think, a distinctly like immigrant background situation where, you know, and again, I don't know if anybody in the room can relate to this, but I think even being in these positions, for those of us who've had parents who couldn't even dream of being in the position because less than 50 years ago, you know, there was no black middle class, you know, in a lot of the places that we grew up. They're just very happy to see you reach that position. And they're like, look, don't rock the boat. Don't say anything. Don't upset anybody. Just collect your check, raise your family, and keep quiet. And I think that's another type of pressure as well. I know that's pressure that I definitely faced from family members of mine, and then the tune changed when my book was successful, and then they were like, okay, good, great, keep it up. So I think that there's like a number of different pressures. For anybody who's dealing with those pressures, I would suggest, you know, just find a support group to discuss these pressures with. Don't bother trying to convince your family. Don't bother doing that, because they're probably not going to be budged on their feelings about that. And honestly, like, why should they? I think that we should recognize the relative privilege that we have to even be in those rooms. But there's also a responsibility on those of us who are the only one in the room to speak up on, when we see injustice and inequality, because I personally don't want to just keep being the only person in the room. Like that. I'm not involved in anti-racism for my personal benefit. I would like to see more people come through. I'd like to see a little bit more parity.
So good. I agree. I will not have this discussion anymore in my house.
Yeah, just don't even tell them what you're doing.
No. It's hard. Well, another issue, I'm being very personal here, I feel, but when you're talking about white privileges in the book, and I'm going to take it a little more in a broader perspective, just talking about privileges and how one can face one's own privileges in different ways. And I remember one specific incident when I was growing my natural hair out. And it was a long process, and I had a discussion with my younger sister about this, and I was trying to convince her to also let her natural hair grow out. And she just threw me off with a comment saying something like, well, Salem, you as a light-skinned, cute girl can wear your natural hair like that, and it will just be some cute, exotic thing. But if I would have that type of hair with my dark skin, as she said, that would create another dynamic and another reaction. And when she said that, that was like, for me, I felt sad, but also I realized the privileges that are also in our communities, and as that there is a specific gaze at people that has a specific brown skin and others. And so how can we as individuals learn about our own privileges to ally ourselves with others?
Well, I don't really think that like a conversation about structural privilege, I think it's deeply incomplete if we are not talking about the discrimination that begets the privilege. So, for example, if I'm talking, let's go back to that CV example. I always use it because I feel like it's super clear. If some people are literally not being considered for the job simply on the basis of their name, they're less likely to be considered, then it stands to reason that other people are more likely to be considered because of their name. So when I'm talking about white privilege in this particular anti-racist context, I'm not actually saying white people are all rich and living in the lap of luxury and there's servants and butlers and, you know, topless men feed you grapes and never struggle, never face hardship, never deal with mental health problems. I'm not really saying that, and I don't understand why people come to that conclusion, but I think that's more about what's going on in their own brains. I'm actually talking about the structural benefit that some people get from other people being discriminated against. And, you know, when it comes to literally applying for jobs, it's a situation where it's essentially a zero-sum game. There's only 1 or 2 positions. And if some people's names are being filtered out because they don't look right, then other people's names are being filtered in because they do look right. And that's really what I'm talking about. And so I think in order to be aware of the benefit that one experiences, that you have to be aware of the lack of opportunity that other people are getting and how your benefit is coming at their expense, you know? I wouldn't say it's always a zero-sum game. I don't like to be that binary, but I think there's lots of examples, even in our physical world, where we can see that that's the case. So, for example, when I was super involved in an activism a few years ago, I was discussing with a group about like where we should meet, and we had agreed to meet in this space in central London, and it was like free for us to meet in, but the problem is it's in a super old building, and it wasn't accessible for people with like disabilities at all. It was all just like you had to go up loads and loads of stairs, and it wasn't like, it literally wasn't aware to us until somebody was like, I literally cannot get in. So you can go there and meet and have the meeting if you want, but that's going to come at my expense, and I want to be there with you. And I was like, oh. Exactly. You know, like that meme of the black man who's like, oh. I was like, oh my goodness, this is something that I've essentially been benefiting from. And it's not a coincidence that I've been meeting in these rooms and there's literally nobody with a disability in that room, because I'm literally doing it at their expense and not even considering it, you know. I write about that a little bit in the book. And so, yeah, that's what I would say. Really, one doesn't have to be exactly like the person in order to understand. You just have to listen to their perspective, consider the evidence and be like, yeah, okay, I get that now. What can I do to share a bit of what I'm benefiting from?
Very good. So I think we have some time to let the audience
that's gone quickly.
Ask Reni some questions. Let me see. How much time? Yes, we have time. Good, good, good. So feel free to lead the conversation. I know you have questions, but you're a little bit shy in Sweden, I know. But don't be afraid. Yes.
The microphone is on its way.
Thank you. I'm curious, and thank you for sticking your neck out and being all of the people are affected of racism, their punching bag. So thank you for that. I'm interested of what's the most common question or statement that you get from white people?
Oh. I think I am a victim is not the right word. I think that like I bear a cross of other people's projections onto me. And I think that when it comes to anti-racism, there is a lot of cultural baggage, largely informed by white fear, that any public anti-racist has to navigate when trying to talk about these issues. And so I am quite happy to be accountable, but only for things that I've actually said or in the book. And I think that I sometimes meet hostility based on a lot of preconceived notions from white people in particular who are not actually familiar with my work at all. And I feel that's somewhat disappointing, because I always try, if I feel a visceral opposition to something, ideas or whatnot, I at least try to engage and see and go like, oh, well, is this actually what I think it is? Before vocally like expressing my opposition. You know, I talked to somebody who I basically consider to be a fascist in the book, and that's because I wanted to argue against their ideas, and I thought it was important to ask them, can I just double check? The ideas that I think that you're saying, is this true? And so I think it's disappointing to not be, the, you know, object of other people's projections sometimes. And I think that, like, and the flip side of that is another type of being the object of other people's projections, and that is from white people who are not hostile by any means, but actually open and curious and interested in the work that I do, but given the subject matter, are quite keen to give up their own autonomy or responsibility in the anti-racist conversation. And, you know, I write repeatedly in the book that, you know, white people, if you are dedicated to anti-racism, you know, muck in, start thinking about how to help and whatnot, and there's some small pointers. I say, you know, speak to, you know, white colleagues, white family members about anti-racism in particular. And so I feel I've done, like, quite a lot of anti-racist work at this point, including writing the book. And so there's another projection and kind of objectification I experience in which white people who are largely on my side are like, okay, Reni, what can I do? What can I do? And I'm like, come on, I did all of this already. Now you're asking me to tell you what to do as well? Like, contribute. Like, you've got to do some of the work yourself, right? And so that's another common retort, a common refrain, I would say. And then there's other questions that I'm asked. So right at the beginning of, like, talking about the book when it was published in the English language, something that I think white responses I would get a lot were, oh, well, haha, you're talking to me, hee hee hee, and I'm white, lol. And particularly, I think, journalists, to which I would respond, well, in the UK, journalism is 94% white, so it's highly likely that I would be speaking to a white journalist, wouldn't it, you know? And so that was another response. But largely, you know, I feel very lucky to have largely been received with open curiosity, despite those slightly irritating responses.
Yes, upstairs.
We've got a question up there. Yes, you. Keep the hand up for the microphone.
Thank you so much for the discussion. So I have two questions.
Okay.
Right. The first question.
I can't promise I'll answer both of them. You know, I've got a short attention span.
Yeah, they're kind of related. So.
Okay.
Yeah. So the first question relates to. I really liked at the beginning you talked about looking for alternative histories, and I was wondering. So given that a lot of racialized histories, sexualized histories has been elided out, and what are the alternative ways of archiving or telling stories that might enable a different, more generative and speculative imaginaries of anti-racist politics? That's my first. And I'm asking this because there has been a lot of discussions about the ways in which the notion of inclusion or rights framework doesn't work. It only recuperates the same system of racialization and sexualization. So that's why I'm wondering what might be the alternative of telling racialized histories otherwise. And then the second question relates to the non-performativity of diversity work, especially in institutions. And I'm wondering, so I'm thinking about, you know, the ways in which racialized, I'm thinking more in terms of women of color are often considered as either the responsible ones who need to raise the questions of race, or they are considered as the ones, the killjoys that are the problem. So by raising the question of race, they become the problem. And I was wondering, what are the ways in which...
influenced by Sarah Ahmed, by the way?
Exactly, exactly.
We love her.
So I'm thinking, and you know, there are a lot of debates right now in academia about the relation between identity politics and reimagining solidarity. So I was wondering, what are the ways in which that the questions raised will not fall on the shoulder of racialized others, but at the same time that there will be the possibility for solidarity among different forms of social movements. Yeah, so
interesting questions.
Thank you.
I can tell you're in academia. I'm not.
Yep.
I'm not in academia, but I'll give it a try. We've got a baby on the stage. Hello.
Hey.
Very adorable. Oh, bye. Okay. So the first question, I'm going to go with your second question because that's the one I remember freshly. That's not a word, is it? You're going to have to forgive me. It's been very intense touring so far, so my brain is a bit scrambled. So I kind of feel like I have met a lot of people over the course of talking about this book in public who are diversity workers, and they're always women of colour. And I'm just like, that just seems like the worst job ever. Like, talking about the importance of diversity in an organisation in which they've hired one person to try and convince everybody else, that can't be fun. And I'm sorry to anybody in the audience who does that work. I don't know, I think zooming out, it does seem like a little bit of a doomed task because one will always have to be at the mercy of the organisation that is employing them. And if the organisation's employing you to do diversity work, then you can't challenge them too much because they are in charge of your pay. And so ultimately, I think that it's important to do the work independent of an organisation, but also, you know, collaboratively. And I would say, you know, in response to sort of like you were hinting at sort of like collaborative, like work around progressive activism in general. You know, I'm very inspired by, you know, works like from people like Audre Lorde, in which, you know, she's essentially saying we don't actually all need to be literally on the same political page to work towards the same means. We just need to try and like divest from racism or other forms of like structural discrimination that are getting in the way of us like working with one another, and so that we can just support each other's work. So, for example, I feel that there's work that's happening in the world that I feel isn't directly affecting me, but I'll support them and I'll shout about it and signal boost that work. I'm not transgender, but as a feminist who deeply believes in bodily autonomy and human rights, I'll support transgender people. I don't have to be literally a transgender person to support. And, you know, I think that movement's helped me reflect deeply on the ways in which I benefit from the gender binary, you know? And I think that what I don't need to be doing is going to people who are doing that work and dismissing what they're saying and ignoring them and being hostile, which I think was the kind of response that I'd got from white women in feminism. You know, whilst I've been in Sweden, I've been informed that there's been a review of my book in which the reviewer says, well, I mean, I don't know, I haven't read it because I can't read Swedish. But the reviewer essentially says, you know, feminists can't take on, you know, racism as well as part of the movement. We've got to focus on gender. To which I respond, I'm not really asking you to do anything. I'm just asking you to stop getting in my way, like, and stop being hostile when I'm trying to work on these issues. Like, I'm always supportive of the feminist movement. I just don't like the racism. Like, so if you could drop that, you know, and you don't actually have to have a deep anti-racist critical analysis. I think that would actually be too much to ask from white women who have grown up in white environments and have never really been challenged on racism in their lives apart from by somebody like me. I think it's too much to ask a woman like that to have the same perspective as me. I just ask that she's broadly supportive. I don't even ask her to change her agenda too much. If she could just drop the inherent racism, that's all I ask. And so I think that there's like a lot of space to, and I say inherent, I think particularly there's some white women in the feminist movement for whom they really think that they should be the leaders, and also everybody needs to get their permission to do feminist work, which I think not cool. That's not collaboration, people. that's dictatorship. And so I think that there should be like more collaboration. I also think that like we're largely in a political moment in which it's ripe for collaboration right now. There's a lot of like autonomous, different like political movements for which we all have a broad, similar view of how we would like the world to be, and we can all support each other. I know that wasn't a like direct answer to all of your questions, but I tried my best. So.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you.
Got some more questions? What was the other question? What was the first question? I can't remember now.
Alternative ways of
alternative ways.
The story.
Just write a successful commercial book. Commercially successful, and then go through some archive footage. Supersede the national curriculum. All right, wait, second question.
Hi.
Hello.
First of all, thank you for being here, and it's really intriguing to hear you speak about this subject.
Thank you for having me, everyone.
It always seems like when people talk about race, it's always tend to be on big platforms and organized events and stuff like that. But I'm more interested in when you had this on your tweet about why you no longer talk, you don't want to talk about race with white people. It somehow gave you the opportunity
to do it for the rest of my life.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and I was wondering
the irony. Yeah,
exactly. I was wondering if you, now since then, if you found the formula how to engage easily and allow people to just give you this opportunity of talking about race without it being something like, you're attacking me or you're attacking my way of living and view of life. And
how have I managed to be able to do this work without frequent hostility? It's a good question. And the answer is personal boundaries. And I think like when I reflect on that original blog post that I wrote 5 years ago now, can you believe it? Time really flies. It wasn't actually just about big socio-political issues. It was about me sort of like coming to the conclusion that I had to draw a personal boundary for myself, because being involved in like, you know, progressive activism and feminism and stuff, like I was too often baited into arguments in this social media age where you just look through your phone and like, I'm so angry all the time. Like I was too often baited into like essentially dead-end conflict. And I was deeply invested because I cared so much about the feminist movement. You know, I've been involved in the movement now for a decade. And it was so disappointing for me to be working with and organizing with women who sought to essentially dismiss and deny any discussion about racism in the movement, which, you know, I don't think the movement is particularly exceptional. You know, it's informed by a broader society. But I was so invested and deeply hurt and distressed, and I realized, wow, a good thing I can do to make myself feel better about this is just be like, okay, we're not talking about that. Not that I wouldn't stop working on it, I would continue to work on it, just not, and I would just distance myself from people who kept trying to say that racism was not an issue that affected people in this world. It was a personal boundary. And, you know, as this book continues to travel around the world and I go around talking about it, you know, sometimes maybe you're asking the wrong person because I am in the eye of the storm here. But I try really hard to work on my personal boundaries. So, of course, I have not stopped talking to white people about racism. I've been contractually obliged to do a certain amount of publicity which involves speaking to white people about the book. And so let's not suspend logic when we are discussing the book here. But what I am doing is having higher quality, more open and more compassionate conversations in which I feel truly heard, and I feel that the book is being received openly without, from white people, a sense of hostility and being attacked and, you know, the closed-mindedness and the closing their ears, which is what I was experiencing beforehand. Now, don't get me wrong, that isn't by any sort of coincidence. That's me continuing to put into place my personal boundaries. So I'm often on the receiving end of media requests in which I'm asked to engage in a hostile situation in order to discuss the ideas in the book, in which, you know, you see these things on social media. It's just a screaming match, and it's 10 minutes of screaming and shouting, and nothing's ever in depth, and there's no like real nuance or even like common ground about how we all feel about inequality. It's teased out from it. It's essentially entertainment, and I always say no to those kind of requests, always, because that's not how I want to put forward the case of anti-racism in this world. It's not how I want to. That's not to say that I won't discuss the ideas of the book with people that I disagree with. I'm just not going to discuss it with people who deny the existence of racism altogether. And so, for me, that's what it's all about. Because you can't disagree with something in which there's so much data to prove it. Similarly, I don't think scientists should debate with climate change deniers, you know? Right, have we got time for, I don't know, somebody tell me, have we got time for more questions? What do you think? Last okay, one more question.
I think that actually brings nicely to my question, which is that sometimes, I mean, I talk a lot about race and about gender and a lot about social issues with my friends and people who actually think very similarly to me. And I have tried getting people who I know disagree with me to read your book because I think they shouldn't be hearing it from me, but then they don't want to, or they put it aside and leave it in there. I've gifted this book like for Christmas to a lot of people, and and they won't read it, and they say they will, but they won't. And so I want to ask, how do you or how do we all fill that gap where we're not just shouting to a void of people who agree with us and actually have constructive conversations with people who might not have similar opinions to us?
Well, you know, I can't really say a how-to for everybody else. I can tell you what I did. It's the reason why I wrote this book. I wrote it so that I could try to make the case informed with as much evidence and original reporting and data as I possibly could without being shouted over me. And I do think that there is some responsibility from the people who are politically opposed, you know. I think there needs to be a bit of getting over the defensiveness and meeting the issue with open curiosity. And I can only do so much, and you can only do so much. You know, this is a good 7 years of work. Like, now am I supposed to be planting it in people's hands and chasing them down the street? Please read it, please, please, please. Like, I tried my hardest here to make the case, and I think if somebody who's deeply politically opposed feels upset and attacked and distressed by the fact that it exists, that's something that they need to examine themselves. Ultimately, I don't think that white people lose anything from an anti-racist perspective. I really don't. I think that it can be so, it can add so much to your world to consider that inequality exists and sometimes it's working in your favor. I don't think that there's much to lose. I know that certainly when it comes to, you know, other types of like movements for equality, I've learned so much, and it's really helped me consider the ways in which I've been raised, the ways as somebody who grew up as a girl, how I've been socialized. I think, again, I keep using this example, but particularly with the gender binary, you know, it's really helped me consider these things. And so I just hope that we kind of like move to a place of open curiosity. And I want to acknowledge that I recognize there are some people who feel deeply attacked by the existence of this book and the title and whatnot. And to that I say that, like, in terms of the title, it doesn't actually say, in my opinion, anything negative about white people as a group. Instead, it talks about a decision that I've made for myself. And that was a decision that I made for myself. Obviously broke it immediately, but the first word of the title is the word why. And I think that that word is important because it suggests an explanation. That's the word. It suggests an explanation, and the existence of the book, I think, tells the reader that if you're curious, you can just open it up and see what that explanation is, and you will learn it in the first 5 pages of reading. And that's really all I ever wanted to do with the writing of this book, was just explain my perspective. If somebody sees it and they're wearing glasses that I don't have access to, and they see it and they think it reads Death of the White Man, then, like, I can't take responsibility for that. And this is what I mean a little bit about your question in terms of, like, people bringing their own cultural baggage to the anti-racist conversation. And I think it is informed by fear on the part of some white people, which I kind of feel like, come on, get over it at this point. There's really nothing to lose, apart from a bit of prejudice. So.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Reni, for sharing your knowledge. Thank you for giving us this well-needed book.
Thank you.
Thank you for thank you for being here and just leaning in and taking in her knowledge, and also bringing some very good questions. We wish you all the best.
Thanks. Am I signing books?
Have a nice evening.
Yes, please.
Okay. How's that happening?